Welcome to Novara Live on an awkward day for Matt Hancock. 100,000 WhatsApp messages have been leaked to the Daily Telegraph involving Matt Hancock, various government ministers and advisors from the COVID pandemic. They're billing this as the lockdown files. They think it's incredibly damaging for Matt Hancock. We're going to go through the messages and tell you what we think. I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. How are you doing, Dalia?
I'm good. I think this episode should be called It Goes Down in the DMs. Because, the scandal of it all, I love stories like this. I mean, even though they're representative of a really crap situation, but nothing like some elite on elite violence.
Matt Hancock has suffered the indignity of having thousands and thousands of his WhatsApp messages leaked to the Telegraph. They were leaked by the journalist Isabel Oakeshott and are between Hancock and other ministers over the course of the pandemic, and other advisors, I should say. The Telegraph have written the messages up basically as an expose of Hancock. So they think this is really bad for him. And this is their most damaging claim. So they say the lockdown files. Matt Hancock rejected expert advice on care home testing. WhatsApp messages reveal. Huge leak reveals conversations from 100,000 texts showing how then Health Secretary did not follow Sir Chris Whitty's tough line. So the allegation is he ignored expert advice. Now we can read the first few paragraphs from that story. So the Telegraph write, Matt Hancock rejected the Chief Medical Officer's advice to test for COVID all residents going into English care homes, leaked messages reveal. Professor Sir Chris Whitty told the then Health Secretary early in April 2020, about a month into the pandemic, that there should be testing for all going into care homes. But Mr. Hancock did not follow that guidance, telling his advisors that it muddies the waters. They go on. Instead, he introduced guidance that made testing mandatory for those entering care homes from hospital, but not for those coming from the community. Prior to the guidance, care homes had been told that negative tests were not required, even for hospital patients. The guidance stated that those coming in from the community should be tested. That was eventually only introduced on August the 14th. So the guidance stating that those coming in from the community should be tested was eventually introduced on August the 14th. And then the Telegraph, at this context, between April the 17th and August the 13th, 2020, a total of 17,678 people died of COVID in care homes in England. So the implication there being Matt Hancock ignored the advice. Lots of people went into care homes who weren't tested. And as a consequence, it seems to be suggesting 17,000 people died. So this would be very, very serious if the allegations do stack up. Let's now look at the sequence of messages they use to justify these incendiary claims. They're all from a conversation had on the 14th of April between Hancock and one of his advisors, Alan Nixon. Now, they concern what advice would be included in a COVID and social care action plan, which was due to be published the following day. So the first message we're shown is this. It's from Matt Hancock. Chris Whitty has done an evidence review and now recommends testing of all going into care homes and segregation whilst awaiting result. This is obviously a good positive step and we must put into the doc. So that's Matt Hancock saying Chris Whitty is advising that we test everyone going into care homes. He's pleased with this and he thinks it should be in the document that they're going to publish the next day on COVID and care homes. However, by the end of the day, that position had changed. So instead, by the afternoon, it was only the case that testing would be done on those entering care homes from hospitals and not from the community, including, of course, staff. Now, this is a message from one of Hancock's advisors. This was sent at 6:23 p.m. on the same day. So Alan Nixon says, I wasn't in testing meeting, just to check. Officials are saying your steer is to remove the commitment to testing on admission to care homes from the community, but keep commitment to testing on admission to care homes from hospital. Is that right? And then Alan Nixon, sort of 25 minutes later, messages again saying this. Update. We can say in the doc that it's our ambition to test everyone going into a care home from the community where care homes want. And then in brackets, in the coming weeks is a suggested time frame I've been told. Matt Hancock then responds to that message saying this, fine, tell me if I'm wrong, but I would rather leave it out and just commit to test and isolate all going into care from hospital. I do not think the community commitment adds anything and it muddies the waters. Have that for a Q&A response. So does this prove that Matt Hancock ignored official advice? That, of course, is the claim being made by the Telegraph, but Matt Hancock has pushed back. So this is from one of his spokespeople. Having not been approached in advance by the Telegraph, we have reviewed the messages overnight. The Telegraph intentionally excluded reference to a meeting with the testing team from the WhatsApp. This is critical because Matt was supportive of Chris Whitty's advice, held a meeting on its deliverability, told it wasn't deliverable, and insisted on testing all those who came from hospitals. The Telegraph have been informed that their headline is wrong, and Matt is considering all options available to him. This major error by Isabel Oakeshott and the Telegraph shows why the proper place for analysis like this is the inquiry, not a partial agenda-driven leak of confidential documents. Isabel Oakeshott's agenda, according to Hancock's people, is to cast doubt on the wisdom of lockdowns. Matt Hancock himself hasn't appeared on the media today to answer questions on the leak. One of his allies has, though. Lord Bethell was a health minister under Matt Hancock, and he fielded questions from Nick Robinson on Radio 4.
A decision was taken that day, and it was changed after a meeting. What these messages reveal is that the chief medical officer says all people going into care homes should be tested. Matt Hancock appears to agree with that, but later in the day, after what he says is a crucial meeting, he changes his view. You accept that version of events, I think. Why did he change his view?
Well, he changed his view because there was an operational meeting to talk about how you were actually going to test people and how many actual tests we had. The reality was there was a very, very limited number of those tests. Now, people who were coming out of hospitals had the highest rates of transmission. They were the people who had the highest risk of having the disease because there was a lot of nosocomial infection from other patients within the hospitals. So it was sensible and right to prioritise those coming into social care first. And we were then going to move on to covering absolutely everyone, which is what we went on to do. And it was
weeks later, months later.
It took weeks to scale up our testing. The thing that held us back was not a dispute about the clinical advice. It was simply the operational ability to deliver tests. And that's
Would
why
Chris Whitty agree with that? Were you in the meeting, this crucial meeting? Was Chris Whitty in this crucial meeting?
I don't have... Well, this is the flaw in this whole debate. We only have a few scrappy, gossipy WhatsApps. This is not how government is run.
It's how he did his business.
No, it's not. Absolutely not, Nick. I absolutely reject that. Business was done very formally with meeting notes, with policy recommendations, with a box. That is how the machinery of government works.
But there's 100,000 of these messages. I'm not going to bore the listeners who are reading them. I've got one of yours here in which there is detail of the sort you would expect to be put in formal meetings. Long paragraphs of detail.
But Nick, that little pieces of informal chat between people is very common. Getting me onto this program took very many WhatsApp messages. That's how people work these days. But the formal decision-making is done through
let's go to the substance.
Paperwork. And we don't have that in front of us. And that's why this partial glimpse into the decision-making is so unfortunate, because it gives a misleading impression.
So that was Lord Bethell, who appears in some of the messages. We'll be showing you those in a moment. I mean, what do I think about this? I have to say, I mean, there are some messages which we'll show you later, which I think look very bad for Matt Hancock. I think the circumstances in which these were leaked, as we'll talk about in more detail later, are rather humiliating for Matt Hancock. I actually think with this particular story, which has led the BBC and led all the news platforms all day, is a little bit over-egged. I don't think the WhatsApp messages that the Telegraph has shown us really prove that Matt Hancock ignored medical advice, because it was often the case during the pandemic that the chief medical officer, their job was to give advice about the spread of COVID and the medical issues. Their advice wasn't to say what was operationally possible. So it seems perfectly plausible to me that there was a meeting with Chris Whitty. He said it would be a good idea to, from a pandemic control perspective, to be testing everyone as they go into care homes. And it seems perfectly plausible that then Matt Hancock went into another meeting and with the people who talked about the capacity for testing at the time, and they said, oh, sorry, we can't do this. Then the whole muddies the water thing, I mean, that doesn't seem to me to be a reference to not testing people going into care homes, but rather should we include in a advice document that in the future we will be encouraging care homes to test everyone, but at the moment we don't have tests. Now, potentially that would have been more honest to include in there. I do think that, I mean, as we talked about a lot at the time, the government now, or Matt Hancock and the people who were in government at the time, are very keen to say, Look, the issue was capacity. The issue was all that we struggled to do stuff. Back in the day, back in the period when they were talking about these things at press conferences, they often tried to suggest, oh, no, we don't need to test here for this reason, when the actual reason was they couldn't. So, there's mixed messages going on. Potentially it wasn't as honest as it could be. But I don't think the idea that Matt Hancock ignored Chris Whitty and therefore a load of people died is something that these messages necessarily bear out.
Obviously, we don't know the full story, but there is a believable idea that, what was desirable and what was operationable, that there was a gap between those two things. It doesn't change the fact that throughout the course of the pandemic, however, there was a broader trend of the government, and specifically Boris Johnson, as well as Matt Hancock, ignoring health advice and Whitty's advice on things that were actionable. For example, we know that Britain took a very long time to go into lockdown and consistently delayed it, which meant that we had to have much more stringent and long-lasting, eventually, like really intense lockdowns, much more so than a lot of other parts of Europe, because there was this consistent need to this consistent impulse to ignore medical advice in favor of what was seen as, political point scoring around, not liking kind of lockdowns in general. So that actually more broadly is quite true. In this instance, there is, it seems feasible to me that, the deployment of tests on this scale may have not been possible at that time. However, what I would therefore ask is, why wasn't it possible? Why wasn't it operationally possible at that time? Could it have had anything to do with the fact that the COVID contracting scandal meant that between, I think it was January 2020 and December 2021, a lot of contracts for tests were handed to Randox, which is a major pharmaceutical company, without any without any competition and without the adequate due diligence required to make sure that they would be able to provide the scale of tests that would be needed in the time that they would be necessary. And so it kind of touches on these two broader truths, which is that there were times when it absolutely was viable for the government to follow medical advice, and they chose not to, and that caused, numerous excess deaths. And also the other fact of COVID contracts and the scandal around cronyism there did mean that on an operational level, the COVID response was not as effective as it could have been because of corruption. We don't know if this instance in particular was an example of that. But those broader, I think one of the reasons why this has maybe struck such a nerve is because it feels like there's some kind of evidence for something that we broadly already knew to be true. And I guess whether or not, those broader things are true and the impact of them is going to come out in the inquiry. So I think it's one of those weird things where it's like the broad kind of like thesis of it, I think is true, in that I think medical advice was ignored at times when it shouldn't have been. In this instance, I think there's definitely a possibility that wasn't the case here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's also very relevant that the paper who is deciding how to editorialize these WhatsApp messages has a very clear agenda here, right? So I doubt it's going to be the case that, that they have access to lots of messages with Boris Johnson. It was Boris Johnson who, especially in the second lockdown, massively delayed that, and lots of people died as a result. I assume in this cache of WhatsApp messages, there are some incriminating stuff about him, but I'm not sure if the Telegraph are going to publish that, because I think the reason they called it the lockdown files is because they're against lockdowns. They want this to make Matt Hancock look bad, and because he was fairly amenable to the idea that we needed lockdowns, etc., even if he was fairly incompetent in other ways. As I say, I don't think this is the smoking gun. I do think there are other messages which do make Hancock look very bad, which we're going to go on to now. Cast your mind back to the 1st of May 2020, when at the height of the first lockdown, the then Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, announced this.
At the beginning of last month, at this podium, I set a goal that anyone who needs a test should get a test, and that as a nation we should achieve 100,000 tests per day by the end of the month. I knew that it was an audacious goal, but we needed an audacious goal because testing is so important for getting Britain back on her feet. I can announce that we have met our goal. The number of tests yesterday, on the last day of April, was 122,347. This unprecedented expansion in British testing capability is an incredible achievement.
Now, we always knew that was a pretty ridiculous claim, and that was principally because the 122,000 figure Hancock had sort of announced there, that included tests sent out, so tests sent to people, not tests actually done. But the messages released in the lockdown files show just how ridiculously Hancock and his team behaved while trying to meet this arbitrary target which they set themselves. Now, take this exchange. It's between Matt Hancock and a health minister on the 27th of April, 3 days before the target deadline. So it's James Beffel, Lord Beffel. I spoke to Doug, and Doug is the chief exec of Amazon UK. He says he has some more kits that he could send out on Thursday. I've asked, blanked out, if there could possibly please be enough lab capacity to process these. That's the bottleneck. I'll keep you updated, but one for you to mention if you're speaking to blanked out and feel like gently leaning on that point. Then Matt Hancock replies, if only 20% are being returned, then we can send many, 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 many more out. And then James Beffel says, that's true, since they count from the moment they're sent. I'll prod nicely. Can you please prod too? Now, a normal person, someone who cared about COVID responses would have seen that 20% figure and thought, oh, shit, only 20% are being returned. There's some kind of problem here. We need to make sure people get better at sending back tests. But rather, instead of that, Matt Hancock's response was, oh, only 20% are being returned. That's great. That means we can send more out even when we don't have lab capacity. And we can include that in our final 100,000 figure. So this does not look to me like people who are taking the pandemic particularly seriously, but people who are rather desperate to get the headlines they want. It doesn't look good for them. Also, in the run-up to that press conference we just showed you, and we got an exchange between Matt Hancock and George Osbourne. He was then editor of the Evening Standard. So Matt Hancock says, I need to call in a favour tomorrow. I currently have 22,000 spare slots tomorrow at my drive-thrus, hence I've extended eligibility today. Demand just isn't there. This is obs good news about spread of virus, but hard for my target. So I really could do with a testing splash. Can we make this happen? George Osbourne, then editor of the Evening Standard, replies, yes, of course. All you need to do tomorrow is give some exclusive words to the Standard, and I'll tell the team to splash it. You're almost there. Send the words to me by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Message to London, get someone to brief Joe Murphy too. And Joe Murphy was the political editor of the Evening Standard. Then in the morning, the following morning, Matt Hancock sends, his statement to the Evening Standard. I'm not going to bother reading that to you. And he says, thank you. This is the quote. He's also sent to Joe. And George Osbourne says, great. And this is the weirdest one. Matt Hancock then says, now I'll find out how strong the bonds of loyalty are. And George Osbourne says, you'll make the front page, but not as big as 10 mins ago. Hancock, fair enough. And you'll like the editorial, well done, says George Osbourne. And Matt Hancock in capitals, I want to hit my target. And George Osbourne, I gathered. Now, as I say, I think I'll find out how strong the bonds of loyalty are is the, I suppose, most damning in a way phrase there. It's presumably a reference to the fact that Matt Hancock used to be an aide to George Osbourne. So this is not suggestive of a healthy democracy, right? You've got a health minister who is sending messages to an editor of the paper in London with the widest circulation and then getting whatever he wants on the front of the newspaper. Now, you can say, look, this was a public health message, but it seems to me, if you look at it in the context of all of these other messages we've seen, this is much more about reaching an arbitrary target than it is about actually tackling COVID-19. That's why he sent that message then, not on any other day in the month or the month afterwards. One more exchange on the 100,000 target was this, which I think is pretty damning. So this is from Duncan Selby, Chief Executive of Public Health England. PHE sends the Chief Medical Officer and GCSA a serology report each Thursday. On the numbers for yesterday, our contribution to Pillar 1 was Public Health England Labs, 4,819, Roche, 13,723, and Porton Serology, 1,072. Now, Roche is a German testing company. So this guy's saying, look, 13,000, this is great. This can go towards that target. Matt Hancock says, amazing. That Roche ramp is extraordinary. And then in response, someone called Sam, identity unconfirmed, says, really amazing work, everyone. Well done. The Roche ramp up is a one-off, definitely not one to inform targets in May. We used up a large amount of accumulated stock from April, which is a situation we won't find ourselves in again very soon. So what's going on there? He's trying to get this 100,000 target. And instead of saying, look, it's important that we don't massage these statistics. What we want to show is that we genuinely have a capacity to do 100,000 a day. What they've actually done is Roche had a big stockpile. They used them all in a single day because they wanted to get to that 100,000 target. And then you've got, someone who I presume is an advisor explicitly saying, yeah, but don't think we can do this the next day and the day after and the day after, because what we did was we just used up a stockpile, right? Again, it doesn't seem to me to be people who are seriously interested in building a sustainable testing system to tackle the pandemic, but rather people who really, really want to massage some numbers so that they can meet an arbitrary target. And Matt Hancock can give you the kind of announcement we showed you at the start of this segment. Dalia, do you think these are the damning messages that we've seen so far from this cache of WhatsApp messages?
Yeah, I think that this is far more unequivocally scandalous. And I think it's really interesting that this isn't the one that's been hammed up so much by, the lobby media, because, ultimately, this is the kind of behavior that they all engage in. I don't think that they would see this as particularly egregious. I think that whole kind of we'll see how the bonds of loyalty, it really affirms my idea that our entire political and media establishment is glued together by whatever torturous shit these people have done to each other in Oxbridge, because there is this real sense that the entire political system is based on people doing each other favors and, keeping each other's secrets and weaponizing each other's secrets. And there's just this is not a functional way to run a country. But in terms of the actual content of the messages, I think it really brings home to me this idea of the influencing of politics and of politicians. I really think that increasingly politicians think of themselves much more as influencers than as people who are actually making policy. Because this is a perfect example of that, this obsession with the production of the appearance of a particular reality and spin over concrete reality. And obviously this has always been to an extent part of politics, what things look like, comms has always been a part of politics. But I think that what we've seen in recent years, and I would argue that actually, this begins with kind of the Alistair Campbell-Blair partnership. I don't say this from some kind of centrist, we need to get the grown-ups back in the room, because it's very much the grown-ups that invented this. But I think that it's in recent years, it's really become a lot more kind of endemic, in particular in both the US and in Britain. You look at the way that Boris Johnson conducted himself and how his priority seemed to be the cultivation of his own image and legacy as a kind of Churchillian figure. And to him, what that meant was, speaking in a particular way and presenting a particular kind of cosplay of strength that he thought was associated with, this with Winston Churchill in people's imaginations. You see it with Liz Truss and her attempt to kind of cosplay Margaret Thatcher, and this kind of this complete subordination of concrete reality and political reality and policy to optics and image, and to the creation of particular representations of reality. And in many ways, Johnson was this was what Johnson did in his career before he became Prime Minister, before he became an MP. He was essentially a professional celebrity. He was a panel regular. You look at Donald Trump, this is an ex-reality TV star. He's a product of reality television. And then you look at Hancock going into reality TV after and sort of giving up his, it seemed like being an MP was a springboard for him to become a sort of generic celebrity. And I just think that has had such a corrosive impact on our political sphere and on our political imaginations, when you have this kind of sense that, the logics of like reality TV and that kind of framework is being deployed in policy making, which particularly when you're talking about a pandemic where, quick, impactful decisions have to be made, where people's priorities really matters, has a death toll, as we've seen.
I'm going to show you guys one more exchange between George Osbourne and Matt Hancock. This one is probably even more outrageous. So it starts with, this is from later in the year, by the way. So this is from November 2020. And this is when testing was a bit of a problem. People were struggling to find a test close to themselves. And obviously this was a point when we were getting the beginning of a really serious new wave of COVID. Matt Hancock shares in his chat with George Osbourne a tweet from Matt Chorley, from Times Radio. And Matt Chorley has said, George Osbourne tells me on Times Radio that Major Blair, Brown and Cameron wrote to Johnson privately in July about the need to get a grip on testing. And Matt Hancock says to George Osbourne, what was this for? George Osbourne says, trying to spread the responsibility from you to number 10. I've said it before. Matt Hancock says, okay, but mass testing is going very well. I fear this looks like you asked for me to be overruled. And George Osbourne says, no one thinks testing is going well, Matt. He then goes on to say, if I wanted a test today, I can't get one unless I fake symptoms, and blocked out name is still waiting test results from 3 weeks ago. We went private in the end. My point has been that Downing Street has not thrown the weight and resources of government behind your heroic efforts, and that's why we entered a second lockdown. And by the way, thousands of civil servants are still working on lorry parks in Kent because this government has no sense of priority. I presume that's a reference to the government pouring resources into planning for Brexit. Matt Hancock says, I don't think this is right, but I can see where you're coming from. So this is the editor of the Evening Standard, very cozy chats with the health secretary, talking about how he's trying to shift blame from the health secretary to the prime minister. Now, this is not how the fourth estate is supposed to work, right? There should be some distance between the people who edit the newspapers and the people who make the decisions, the people who the newspaper should be reporting on. Here you have very close friends. George Osbourne often thought to be Matt Hancock's mentor, here actively using his position as an editor of a newspaper to try and shift blame from his mate to someone else. In fact, to someone who was a bit of a political rival to him. So this is not how journalism is supposed to work. And yeah, it's been exposed. And I'm not sure how much you are going to see this written about in mainstream newspapers. I mean, obviously this was published in the Telegraph. It's not secret, but I'm not sure if this is going to be latched onto as strongly as some of the other claims, because so many journalists know that they're kind of guilty of this kind of thing as well. Maybe not as explicit as this, but it doesn't seem to me to be particularly out of the ordinary. The contents of Matt Hancock's leaked WhatsApp messages make him seem like a bit of an idiot. But the way they got leaked is perhaps even more embarrassing for the former health secretary. That's because they were leaked by this woman, Isabel Oakeshott. She's a right-wing journalist and prominent lockdown skeptic who, for some bizarre reason, Matt Hancock employed to co-write this book. It's called The Pandemic Diaries, the inside story of Britain's battle against COVID. Now, to help write the book, Matt Hancock provided Oakeshott with 100,000 WhatsApp messages sent between him and other ministers and officials at the height of the pandemic. Presumably, that was after Oakeshott, had already got the publicity she wanted from this book. Apparently, she didn't collect a writer's fee, which is, potentially she always had ulterior motives along the way. I've got no idea. I don't want to imply she does, but it seems all slightly odd. Isabel Oakeshott, in justifying why she leaked this to the Telegraph, explained she released the WhatsApp messages to avoid a whitewash in the upcoming COVID-19 public inquiry. The book, co-written with Oakeshott, sold fewer than 4,000 copies in its first 2 weeks of release, or after its release.
The great irony here is that Hancock is talking about how, this is not an appropriate way to discuss to figure out what happened. This should be the realm of a public inquiry. This should be done in a rigorous and neutral way. It shouldn't be hashed out in a newspaper. But that falls apart when you consider how much resources he's put, albeit not very effectively, towards laundering his own reputation and laundering his own role. And trying to essentially rewrite or at least whitewash what took place while he was health secretary. It begins with this book itself. Why else are you writing a book called The Pandemic Diaries if not to portray an image of what happened that is favorable towards you. You know, that's not exactly leaving this to a public inquiry and saying, you know, the only appropriate forum for this is kind of an independent investigation. But also, you've been all over the place talking about essentially trying to absolve your own responsibility and talking about how this whole thing operated from your perspective, to try and make people like you, to try and make them forget what happened under your governance as health secretary. So you can't really have it both ways. And, you know, I'm not necessarily here going to put all my faith into the integrity of Isabel Oakeshott. I'm not necessarily going to say that her portrayal of how what happened is going to be, you know, particularly rigorous. This is not necessarily a very honest or good faith actor in general. I'm sure she did leave out some context, but also Oakeshott is kind of a menace of Hancock's making, you know, like he's playing the same game as her. He's just frustrated that she's on a different team now.
I suppose what was so stupid is she was always kind of on a different team. She was throughout the pandemic a real lockdown skeptic, and that is Matt Hancock's signature policy. So I don't know what he thought he was doing. Not a man with much foresight, although that's not what his book says. So as you say, Dalia, you know, we're hearing from Matt Hancock and his people now that this is a partial expose. We don't see all the messages, we just see some of the messages. And then they say, also, these messages don't make full sense without seeing all of the other documents. That will all be available to the public inquiry, so wait until the public inquiry. Now, that would be somewhat legitimate if Matt Hancock hadn't gone on I'm a Celebrity to try and launder his reputation, hadn't now started a TV company because he's so keen to constantly be speaking to the public about how actually he did the right thing during the pandemic. And especially if he hadn't wrote this goddamn book, which seems to all be about making him seem like he always did the right thing. Now, I have to admit, I haven't read this book. I don't have any plans to. Someone who has, though, is Rachel Cunliffe at The New Statesman. This is the headline. This was her review. So before this leak, this was her review of the book after reading it. Matt Hancock's Pandemic Diaries are a delusional piece of self-aggrandizing fan fiction. And she says, in these retrospectively constructed entries, Hancock casts himself as the hero of both the COVID crisis and his love life. It's pathetic. And as I say, I hadn't read this book, so I was surprised to hear about this point about entries being retrospectively constructed. And this is important because his pandemic diaries are actually all written after the event, but with entries showing the date and then written in the present tense. So it includes Wednesday, the 1st of January, woke up in Suffolk after a quiet New Year's Eve. Right. But that wasn't written on the 1st of January. That was written a few years later, probably by Isabel Oakeshott, pretending to be Matt Hancock, waking up on New Year's Eve. So all very strange. All very Matt Hancock, actually. On the rewriting of history as well, this is the politically significant bit. Cunliffe writes this. Are we really to believe, for example, that our omniscient protagonist spotted that a mystery pneumonia outbreak in China would be a key public health priority on New Year's Day 2020? Should we take his word that he started thinking about a vaccine 5 days later? The sustained use of the historical present tense is a trick to mask just how subjective and unreliable the narrator is. So are the tangential asides that try to make the diaries feel more like an authentic depiction of everyday life in all its randomness. So here she includes one of the diary entries. I cannot believe that Andrew Wakefield, the anti-vaxxer, is still in circulation spreading his misinformation, or that he used to date the supermodel Elle Macpherson. How did that happen? So again, this is Isabel Oakeshott going back and pretending to be Matt Hancock and making light-hearted comments about what was going on at the time. And then Cunliffe goes on to say this. In context, the headline-generating revelation that Boris Johnson said the virus would probably go away when initially warned reads like just another attempt by Hancock to show off his superhuman foresight. Now, of course, if you ever needed evidence, if it wasn't obvious to you already that Matt Hancock doesn't possess superhuman foresight, writing this book, The Pandemic Diaries, with the help of someone who hated his signature policy and then handing her a cache of all his downloaded WhatsApps, well, it hardly makes him seem like a clairvoyant. Brexit has been hard on a lot of people, from the Eastern Europeans who felt they had to leave the country in the wake of a backlash against them, to the fishermen who have seen their catches shrink and their jobs disappear. Of course, let's not forget the Northern Irish who've been caught in political limbo, threatening their hard-won peace. It's been tough on all of them. But there is a danger that we overlook the real victims of this referendum. I'm talking about the ruling class Brexit headbangers. They've been having pretty public breakdowns and begging us to pity them. Sarah Vine has provided the latest instance of this phenomenon. She's a columnist for the Daily Mail and the ex-wife of Tory Cabinet Minister Michael Gove. She was an ardent supporter of the Leave campaign, but despite being on the winning side, now she wants your tears. Brexit cost me friendships and my marriage. I pray Rishi can finally end this uncivil war. Now, it's well known that Sarah Vine and Michael Gove had a big falling out with David Cameron and his wife Samantha over Brexit. Cameron had promised an EU referendum in the Conservatives' 2015 manifesto, but he hadn't expected his close friend Gove to campaign for Leave. That was a fact that Gove and Vine kept secret from the Camerons. In her article, Vine describes the end of that relationship. I should have told David sooner that Michael was going to campaign for Leave. Perhaps if he had known from the start, it wouldn't have felt like such a betrayal to him and Samantha. But for me, it was a question of loyalty to my friends or loyalty to my husband. A horrible choice, which I am relieved and sad I will never have to make again. I knew in my heart which way Michael would go. I could have told them, but I didn't. I was afraid of what might happen. In trying to avoid confrontation, I stupidly created more. It's a lesson I won't forget. And she goes on. It's hard to articulate, but I feel that now, perhaps with the end finally in sight, the time is right. Not least because I do think that, in a way, my own turmoil reflects that of many others whose own families have been deeply divided by this issue, and in some cases, even torn apart like mine. Friends who have not spoken for years, relatives at war, neighbours at loggerheads. If Sunak's plan succeeds, there is every chance that some of these rifts may finally begin to heal. For me, sadly, it's too late. I think it runs too deep. The best I can really hope for is, like I said earlier, closure. I was too close to it all, burnt too badly. Ultimately, Brexit cost me not only some of my dearest friendships, but also my marriage. I believe some of that, right? I believe, some families and friendships were divided over their views on the EU. It was very divisive. But I'm not sure how much sympathy I have or anyone will have when the people in question are David Cameron, the Remainer who offered a referendum on Brexit just to help his career because he thought he would win it, and Michael Gove, the guy who led the Leave campaign, which was all based on a bunch of lies. I have no sympathy for these people. I don't think many people will. Never mind, though. Let's get back to the pity party. Maybe the next part will make you feel bad for. Losing my friends was a direct consequence of that vote back in June 2016 and happened overnight. The rest was more indirect and drawn out. It has more to do, really, with my own failings and how the fallout affected my mental health and to a large extent altered my personality irrevocably. Quite simply, I am not the person now that I was before all this began. I struggle to recognize myself at all. So many of the things I believed, the way I understood the world, it's all so different now. It feels like another life. Another person entirely. The best way I can describe it is the difference between seeing the world through the eyes of a child and seeing how it really is, how people really are. Before Brexit, I had an easy sense of security, a Pollyanna-ish feeling that I belonged and always would. Now, not so much. And Vine ends with this. Truth is, there are some things that simply can't be fixed, that are for a variety of reasons broken beyond repair. When that happens, you can drive yourself nuts trying to glue bits back on, but they never stick. What my family went through as a result of Brexit, what happened with the Camerons and our wider group, how we became the focal point for Remainer anger, how people lost sight of who we really were and saw only what was said and written, the lies that were told, how it all was swept up by social media and spun around into a toxic tornado that seemed to engulf everything. In the end, it was all too much. Now remember, these are the people who in their incredibly civil, joyous relationship, before the heady days of Brexit, they spent 6 years implementing the violent austerity that killed a hell of a lot of people and made life miserable for millions. But that didn't make it to their cozy dinner parties. So when they were making everyone's life miserable with austerity, still everyone at their cozy dinner parties was like, oh, isn't it wonderful? Aren't we doing such a wonderful job? Yes, Sarah Vine, so lovely. So is Michael Gove, David Cameron, and Samantha Cameron. Oh, what a lovely bunch of people. And then you had this issue which divided the elite, and suddenly for the first time ever, they meet people who are a little bit angry with them because they live these insular lives where all the people they'd met before that don't really like working class people and are happy to make them poor and miserable and are happy to demonize migrants, etc., etc. The list goes on. But the moment there was one issue which divided the elite, which, by the way, we all had to talk about for years because David Cameron, as I say, brought on that referendum for politically opportunistic reasons. We're now supposed to have sympathy with these people. Now, I don't. Of course, O'Vine isn't the only person looking for sympathy. Northern Ireland Minister and Brexit Spartan Steve Baker appeared on Newsnight after the announcement of the Windsor Framework, that's Sunak's deal with Ursula von der Leyen. Now, during that interview, this happened.
You were effectively excluded from these negotiations. You didn't really know the detail until this morning. Last night, you said you could have been on the verge of resignation.
Yes.
As Northern Ireland Minister, what do you think about the fact that you were excluded?
Well, when I saw the Prime Minister last night, he gave me the good reason why I was not included. And it was a good and noble reason, which I am not in a position to share with you. And I hope people will understand that sometimes these things are necessary. But I actually feel regretful that I was a bear with a sore head over this. He had a good reason, and what's more, he's impressed upon me that actually, in a sense, I was present in the room because he did read the papers that I gave him, and they did influence what's been done, and I'm very proud of that.
You're emotional, Mr. Baker.
7 years of this cost me my mental health. The beard, the jewellery is about me, my recovery. In November 21, I had a major mental health crisis, anxiety and depression. I couldn't go on. People couldn't tell. I made a big keynote speech in the afternoon. But make no mistake, holding these tigers by the tail, Brexit, COVID recovery group, net zero scrutiny group, the tax stuff we did with Conservative Way Forward, took its toll. We're all only human. And the way I've led rebellions, no one should have to do. And this is an important moment for me personally, because I can authentically say, he's done it. If only everybody will read the text, think seriously about what an amazing achievement this is, what an incredible opportunity it provides for the people of Northern Ireland, and actually for the whole of Europe to move beyond this awful populism we've suffered. Just be sensible and grown up. Do the right thing by 1.9 million people. And the ripple effects for everybody else. You bet I'm emotional, because this book ends a 7-year chapter of my life, which I will be glad to close.
Now, I want to be careful here because I want to make clear I'm not going to doubt that he had some, emotional problems during this period. All people in all different situations have emotional problems, whether or not it's because of things you agree with or disagree with. But when you listen to that list of rebellions which he has fought, which someone shouldn't have to fight. I mean, in a way, no one should have to fight them because they're bad rebellions to fight, right? He listed the COVID recovery group, net zero group, Euro Research Group. So these were all terrible lobby groups, right? So the COVID Research Group, they were the ones who, basically wanted to not do lockdowns and to kind of take COVID on the chin, very close to the Great Barrington Declaration. So the people who said, let's go for herd immunity early and quick, lots more people would have died. The Net Zero Scrutiny Group is essentially people saying net zero is too expensive, let's forget about climate change. And then the European Research Group was obviously, they were the people who wanted the hardest Brexit imaginable. So these are three really bad campaigns, that are going to cause a lot of pain and trauma if they get their way. I mean, on COVID they have. On Brexit they have. On COVID they didn't so much. On net zero, hopefully they won't. But if they get their way on net zero, which is to say scrap these targets, a lot more people are going to be living in very difficult situations where they're going to have mental health crises, which, I hazard to suggest are probably more serious than people who just had to do a bunch of rebellions in Westminster.
It just really shows, I think, the complete disconnection with the absolute chaos that ordinary people have been living under for the past several years. In that segment from Sarah Vine, she talks about, I'm so glad I'll never have to make that decision again about, whether to stand by my minister husband or my prime minister best friend. It's like the decision, like when we're talking about decisions that have had to be made as a result of this Brexit campaign that have huge gravity, it's like people who felt like they had to leave the country because it wasn't a welcoming place to them anymore. We're talking about migrant workers, many of whom are low wage, who have contributed huge amounts, who have made, the particularly like the nightlife and hospitality industry in this country possible, feeling like they have to leave because of how hostile. That's a real decision that is, traumatizing and requires sympathy. And Sarah Vine, I think, has very little sympathy for that, considering the paper that she writes for, which has a huge responsibility for creating those conditions. And that disconnection, it's like for Sarah Vine, it seems like the headlines here aren't, like food shortages and the loss of freedom of movement and how that's torn families and friendships apart in real, like concrete ways, and the kind of unbearable political stasis that we've been in, and the chaos and the spike in xenophobia and all that. No. Like the headline here is, I realized I don't really like my husband and I fell out with some of my friends. And it's just like, I wish that was, the main injury that we had all experienced as a result of the last few years. But it speaks to the way in which so many, and this, is reflective of like the class position of our media, and particularly prominent people in our media, is class shields them from the material realities and outcomes of policy. And this means that essentially they see this all as just like discourse. Like they just see this all as like discourse, like an exchange of opinions. And sometimes that exchange of opinions, becomes like hurts your feelings, or it becomes divisive. And it's like, no, this is like material realities that happen as a result of this discourse and of these conversations that you guys are seeing as kind of political point scoring. And in many ways, I think sometimes this idea that like Brexit created divisiveness is a really kind of like, it tells me so much about how you've experienced living in this country. Because for me, what Brexit did was it brought to the fore a lot of contradictions and divisions and, to an extent, toxicity that has been in the fabric of British life for a really long time now, and that has been felt by the sharp edges, at the sharp edges of our economic and political system. Migrants that have been routine, and refugees that have routinely been thrown under the bus in the name of a broader populism, and who have been, portrayed in ways that make them literally unsafe in their workplace and unsafe in the street. They have a very acute sense that Britain has been divided and has had this problem for a really long time. And it says so much to me that whilst, Brexit obviously did bring a lot of that to the fore, but it didn't invent that. And I think only if you're really disconnected from the reality of a lot of working class people can you sit there and say, oh, like, Brexit was that like horrible thing that made us all really divided and all, like kind of made things really unpleasant. Thank God we can close the door on that now, to see that as an aberration, rather than to see that actually it was kind of the coming to a head of issues that had been undergirding British life for a really long time, not least because of the contributions of the paper that Sarah Vine writes for.
It's a topic we've come back to a few times here at Novara. The Panorama documentary is Labour anti-Semitic. It did huge damage to Jeremy Corbyn's electoral prospects in 2019, and now it's in the news again. That's because a heated row about it has broken out in the pages of The Guardian. So the story here begins with an article written by George Monbiot. Its main point is that Starmer's Labour Party is wasting a lot of money and political capital by pursuing a lawsuit against 5 associates of Corbyn, or 5 staffers in Labour when Corbyn was leader. They're accused of leaking an internal Labour report to the press in April 2020, the so-called Labour leaks. But the part of Monbiot's article that's caused the fuss is about one interview in the Panorama documentary. Let's look at the clip in question. It's with Ben Westerman. He was a complaints investigator for the Labour Party and is also Jewish. He's being interviewed by John Ware, the journalist behind the Panorama episode.
Ben Westerman received dozens of complaints. While interviewing one member, he was confronted with the very anti-Semitism he'd been investigating.
And we finished the interview. The person got up to leave the room and then turned back to me and said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "What do you mean, where am I from?" And she said, "I asked you, where are you from?" And I said, "I'm not prepared to discuss this." And they said, "Are you from Israel?" What can you say to that? You are assumed to be in cahoots with the Israeli government. It's this obsession with that just spills over all the time into anti-Semitism.
At the time the documentary aired, nobody knew which party member was under investigation for that, but it later emerged that the person being questioned was Helen Mark. She attended the disciplinary meeting with her friend and fellow Labour member, Rika Bird, who joined her as a witness. Both Marks and Bird are Jewish and both are pensioners. This is what Monbiot wrote about the Panorama clip. Perhaps the most decisive blow to Corbyn's leadership was the BBC Panorama programme Is Labour Anti-Semitic? It interviewed a former Labour official who, it claimed, was confronted in a disciplinary hearing by the very anti-Semitism he'd been investigating. He alleged that the woman he was questioning asked him, quote, "Where are you from? Are you from Israel?" unquote. But the two women in the meeting, both of whom are Jewish, had recorded the conversation with his permission. Backed by their recording, whose veracity no one seems to have disputed, they say it shows that she said something entirely different. Quote, "What branch are you in?" unquote, meaning what branch of the party. And that when he told her he didn't think that was relevant, she said simply, "Oh, okay." Now, that part of George Monbiot's article was enough to set the Panorama producers off. John Ware and the show's producer Neil Grant fired off a letter to The Guardian. In it, they said this. He refers to a tape recording which he suggests shows that the account given to Panorama by a Labour Party official investigating allegations of anti-Semitism in Liverpool was wrong in recalling that he'd been asked by a Jewish woman if he was from Israel. In fact, the tape to which Monbiot refers is not definitive of the entirety of the conversation, since it stops abruptly just at the point when the official says he was asked if he was from Israel, having been twice pressed by the woman to say which Labour branch he was from. She did not, as Monbiot writes, simply say, "Oh, okay," and leave it at that when he declined to answer her question by saying it wasn't relevant. She persisted, "Oh, no, it might not be relevant, just thought it might be interesting." So the conversation seemed to be heading in the direction recalled by the official before the tape cuts out. Now, it's unclear why that would be heading in the direction recalled, but in any case, unluckily for the show's producers, that recording is widely available online, and it doesn't really seem to abruptly just cut out like they claim. Now, this is a recording of that meeting. It's published by The Canary. We're going to play it right to the end. You'll hear the voice of the investigator, Ben Westerman, and the witness, Rika Bird, is the person asking questions.
There's nothing more for me to say on that.
Okay. I don't know whether you want to.
No, I'm just curious because I haven't been in the Labour Party very long, and I've certainly never been to anything like this informal interview before. So I'm just curious about, like, what branch are you in?
I don't think that's relevant.
Oh, okay.
I hope that's okay. I'm sorry, I don't think where I'm from is at all relevant to the investigation.
Yeah, I just misunderstood. I thought the investigation bit about me not being a silent witness was...
No, it is. You're more than welcome to ask questions, but I reserve the right to not answer them, and I feel that's a question about my personal situation, which I don't think is relevant to the situation in Full Riverside.
Oh, no, it might not be. It's just, but it might be interesting.
I'm not prepared to discuss my dress, basically.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
If you have anything else to add or any questions that you have regarding anything, please feel free to email me. I'll make a note of what you said about the SAR, and I'll pass it on to the data protection, the subject access request.
Yeah.
SAR.
Yeah.
And I'll pass it on. I'll just say that I'll, make sure it was done thoroughly. As I said at the beginning, I will draw up my conclusions and pass them on to the NEC Disputes panel in January, after which we hope to get an AGM sorted as quickly as possible, because obviously we're outside of the year now, so we need to get that done quickly, and move forward.
Great.
So thank you for your help.
That recording doesn't seem to end too abruptly at the point they talk about. So how did Ware and Grant come to the impression that the recording cuts out just after Rika says, quote, "just thought it might be interesting"? Now, it didn't cut out after that. That's what they said in the letter. Now, could it be that they haven't bothered to listen to it all at all? Now, I hope so. Otherwise, it seems just like a straight falsehood. The women were interviewed for Al Jazeera's Labour Files. That's a 4-part documentary looking into the contents of the Labour leaks. Here's what they said.
When he says, where are you from? Are you from Israel? That's an absolute lie. I didn't say that.
With Westerman's permission, the two women record the interview.
The full recording shows what actually did happen.
Curious because I haven't been in the Labour Party very long and I've certainly never been to anything like this informal interview before. So I'm just curious about, what branch are you in?
I don't think that's relevant.
Okay.
I hope that's okay. I'm sorry, I don't think where I'm from is at all relevant to the investigation.
I did ask Westerman, what branch are you from? Meaning what branch of the Labour Party, because it was a Labour Party internal investigation. The word Israel never came into the exchange between me and Westerman.
At the time, I could hardly believe it, but I actually feel very angry about it now, because I feel it's so trivialising what is a really important issue.
So from John Ware's letter, it seems like he could have watched that, right? But there was a minute after that. So I don't see how they think it could have abruptly ended if they'd seen the whole clip. Anyway, those two women have now written into The Guardian too. So in response to the letter from John Ware and the programme's producer, they said, the programme makers continued to defend the sequence on the grounds that the Israel question may have been asked after the tape was switched off. We emphatically deny that this was the case. The tape runs for a further minute of amicable chat about procedural matters. Not only did we not ask the question, it is inconceivable that we would have done so. We are both Jewish pensioners, a fact that Panorama failed to mention. The programme makers have at no stage offered us the opportunity to refute their false allegations against us. We trust that they will now withdraw them and apologise. Now, it seems unlikely they will withdraw them and apologise because, the BBC and the journalists behind this have been doubling down on this for months now. But it does seem really, really bizarre to me, right? So you've got a claim from one individual. So one individual who is working for the Labour Party saying something which I have to say is quite implausible. It seems pretty odd to me that you would have some people in a disciplinary meeting asking someone, are you from Israel? Right? I mean, for one, clearly the guy was British, right? You heard his accent in that recording there. You'd have to be a very strange person to ask the person, are you from Israel? So it seems implausible off the face of it. Then we have a recording of the interview where that's not said. And the point at which John Ware seems to think it would be said, we can actually hear that. There is, as these two ladies say, amicable chat. So this to me, we don't have proof that it didn't happen, but the weight of evidence to me seems to suggest it probably didn't. And the weight of evidence definitely doesn't suggest it did. Yet you have a documentary that used this as one of its core claims. And it wasn't just any old YouTube documentary. This was primetime BBC, which was incredibly damaging to one of, to the person who wanted to be the next prime minister, to the leader of the opposition. Now, that is really important. And it seems to me there hasn't been any justice done here, right? Everyone is just happy to sweep this under the carpet. And they say, oh, well, this is over, Well, this was a big issue that brought down a party leader, right? And so if one of the core pieces of evidence in that whole row turns out to, at best seem based on, sloppy evidence, seems weak. You've got one witness, two other witnesses there deny it and have, some prima facie evidence that it didn't happen, then that seems to me that it shouldn't have been broadcast on prime time on the BBC. And that we're still seeing them double down when you've got someone like George Monbiot sort of saying, oh, I've looked at all the evidence, this seems implausible. And then you've got a letter essentially from the director and the producer, which I think, does misconstrue the evidence because they say the recording cuts out straight after a part at which it doesn't cut out. It looks very sloppy to me. And this is important, right? Because this, what I think looks like fairly sloppy journalism, had a huge impact when it came to the course of politics in this country, and still is accepted by journalists left, right, and centre as being a good bit of quality journalism, which was a real, expose. This was truth to power. This was really upstanding journalists standing up for a minority against a sort of brutal and vicious party leadership, when actually it seems like it was kind of just smearing nice old people. Dalia, thank you for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
We will be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. for another stream. Thanks for joining us this evening. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.